I can actually do that myself. I can do something myself. I can tutorize people. I can switch on microphones. Wow, I should become a professor at this university. Yeah, welcome back to another session of our lecture series. We are not in the unhappy position that we were in 2000, when weeks and weeks after the actual election, some commentator, I remember, quoting Walt Whitman, "Oh, Captain, my Captain, the whole election's done, we've counted and recounted and nobody knows who's won." That's not the case today, except for the man in the White House. Everybody actually knows who's won, or rather, I think we have to suspect that he does actually know, but he pretends that a lot of other people don't. So he tries to convince the many of those who voted for him that he is actually the winner. And if I can predict something at this point, he will probably keep insisting on this for the rest of his days. That is, I make a prediction now here into a running microphone and camera, and maybe you'll confront this later on. Esther, I'd love to hear your opinion on it. I'd say by January 6th, and hopefully after having been defeated in Georgia for the two Senate positions, so I'm not too positive about that happening. He will move to Mar-a-Lago, and from there, and in the rallies that he will start doing, because it's actually the only thing that he does well, he will then, for the next 4 years, keep on claiming that he was not defeated. And you know how they rigged the elections? I can literally hear that already. Yeah? So that's what I expect at this point in time. We discussed the effects and the outcomes of the election as far as they were visible already 2 days after, on Thursday the 5th, I think it was. And now we have Esther Tabitha Earbin, Juris Doctor, back here. She has a doctor already from the University of North Carolina. Yeah, it's slightly different in the US. She'll tell you more about it. But JD actually means it's not JC plus 1. It's actually a Juris Doctor, University of North Carolina, School of Law, Chapel Hill, North Carolina, USA. That's a pretty good address. And she's still going for a PhD for a Doctor Juris, the other way around, from the University of Freiburg. She has experiences in a variety of fields. The bachelor was originally in fine arts, a visual communications program at Indiana University, one of our partner universities in the US. But I don't think we've ever had a student at the Heron School of Art and Design that she graduated from. And she's been a legal counsel to GlaxoSmithKline in North Carolina in 2013, and in 2014 she was a certified student practitioner in Orange County for the Orange County Public Defender in, again, North Carolina. But the longest standing experience, and quite interesting for a variety of fields, including the current pandemic, are her 14 years as the Special Programs Coordinator and Executive Assistant in Marion County Public Health Department, Indianapolis, Indiana. Since 2015-16, she's been in Germany, first in Tübingen, and since 2016 in Freiburg, lecturing, even an intro to German law. And as a teaching fellow in Tübingen, teaching criminal law and procedure, the American experience. And she's also, for the last 2 years, taught here cultural studies at the English department of our university. Believe it or not, she's actually planning on going back to the US. And that's before the inauguration. We've tried to dissuade her from it, but she's adamant that things will get sorted out. Things will be all right in the US. I have my reservations about that, and we'll keep your room, so that you can come back if you want. But for the moment, we'll have to see about all that. Today, she's going to talk about remaining silent, race, crime, and US politics, so giving us a wider frame of some of the things that we've been seeing for the last few days, weeks, months, and years, and which may appear slightly incomprehensible to those of us with no deeper knowledge of the United States. Esther.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to take this off. Thank you very much for having me here this evening. It's a pleasure to introduce a little bit of criminal law into the political discussion in the U.S., as is one of the areas that I'm most passionate about, but it also has a lot to do with the issues that you'll hear going on in the next few months, and have also some loose relation to some of the issues you've already heard. So before I get started, I want to just give you a small introduction to the U.S. criminal justice system. There's some important things that you need to know, not only about the system and the way we either see crime or justice, but also in the way that we see politics, right? Starting with our political culture. So the type of people that are interested in criminal justice, the type of people that are interested in laws, procedures as it relates to crime, and then also our ideas about violence all make up our political culture. And not just popular culture, but it has a lot to do with that. For example, we really have a fascination with electing actors. We really enjoy our politicians, especially our presidents, to have a little acting experience, as Ronald Reagan did. Another politician, not quite president, that you might recognize is Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was the governor of California. So again, we tend to have a unique political culture that also tends to merge with entertainment. And of course, our commander-in-chief right now is quintessentially the entertainment mogul that many people were familiar with before he actually became a politician, acting in many, many movies and television shows and series, which also lends to the way people see him as a public figure. The other thing that is important to understand is that when I talk about criminal law, it's not just federal policy. Most of criminal laws, for example, who gets arrested for killing or who is arrested for a certain reason is state-based. So this makes our local and state elections extremely important. You can also tell a lot about a political culture based upon its criminal laws. For example, you see here California, Nevada, Oregon. It's a dark green on my screen, but on your screen it's kind of a goldish, which is an interesting contrast. These are the states that have legalized marijuana, all right? They have certain ideas on drugs and criminal policies, both for recreational purposes or drugs for recreational purposes, or even the way it's seen in medicine and science. And then you have other states that are still deciding. And that was another issue in this election. One of the things to quickly connect to, especially as far as our topic in race and crime, is that marijuana legislation is not just about giving people the right to use drugs or not criminalizing drugs. A lot of this war on drugs had a lot of connection to racial politics. So some of the states that are legalizing drugs or allowing them to be decriminalizing are trying to reverse some of the racial effects that the war on drugs have had on certain populations, especially African American populations. And this is another little insight on how state politics can also affect or be connected to criminal law, the death penalty. So blood, red states, not Republican, but death penalty states are red. So that is a state decision. Whether or not someone can be executed for a crime is a state decision. So one of the things that is interesting to note is that California, that has also legalized marijuana, also voted to keep the death penalty. So you can have a state that is very liberal on certain areas, such as drug reform and criminalization of drugs, but also very conservative as it relates to issues such as the death penalty. So as such, the president is not the only important politician that is elected. Even though this election, this presidential election, has been the most watched, one of the things that has been very interesting is looking at how some of the other races have gone. So, for example, you have state elections, so not only the president, but the senators and the congresspersons. So congressmen and congresswomen are voted on by the states. And so you can see a difference in the way that people are looking at political issues by how many people were elected to Congress. For example, this year, I believe there was a record number of women that ran for Congress and were elected, and this has changed over time. Then you have the state elections, so governor, the governor races, state senators, the state legislatures, such as the state senators, representatives, and then also judges. One of the things that is important to realize is that our judges are also politicians. So people who decide on criminal laws and interpret laws are also politicians. Local elections are also extremely important, and just to point out a key group that is elected for criminal policy, especially as it relates to the issues of this year, the city-county councils. City councils are the elected officials that determine police budgets, okay? So when we were talking about some of the protests over the summer, and you might have heard some signs such as defund the police. These are decisions that city-county councils have to make, and those elections are not as given as much attention as some of the more national elections, but this is hopefully changing over time. So, as I mentioned, these elected officials are important to criminal law because they look at three very important areas and three very important sources to criminal law in the U.S. We are a common law system, which means that judges' opinions become very important to the way policy and law develops, okay? So the first source that we have for criminal law is the Constitution. So our Supreme Court will interpret the Constitution based upon facts given to them in a case. So the president who nominates and selects Supreme Court judges is going to be pretty influential on how the Constitution is interpreted. So this is also why the president is an important area or an important politician, and the election is important. But also in the middle, you have statutes. The statutes, the actual criminal laws, are developed by our state legislatures. So when it comes to decriminalizing something like marijuana or implementing the death penalty, that's where those state politicians are extremely important. And this also connects to the culture of the state and the region. So you can have very liberal or left-leaning views in the Senate or the state legislature. But if you have more right-leaning views, your criminal laws are going to adhere to more of those ideologies. So this is going to be death penalty, gun rights, as far as allowing for more gun protections, and so on and so forth. And then case law. Case law is where the lower judges, such as appellate courts, such as state laws and constitutions, those some of those are elected, but they also determine the shape of criminal law. So, for example, some of the cases before they go to the criminal court on what rights the police have to search your car are going to be very important for those state judges. So this is something that I think it's important to remember when we talk about which elections are important in the U.S. and how do they impact how the U.S. sees certain issues like crime. So criminal law has a very close history with this concept of race. And the U.S. not only looks at race from a standpoint of identity, but it's also a very legal area. So I'm going to touch on that a little bit so you can understand. I mean, it starts with this concept of all men are created equal. So when this came from the Declaration of Independence, of course, the institution of slavery existed. So it was not that all men were not created equal. It was who was considered to be a man, all right? And the Supreme Court decided in a case called the Dred Scott case that those who were African American or black or Negro were 3/5 of a person, okay? So it wasn't that they were a man, they were a percentage of a man, okay? So this is extremely important to understand as to how this relates to future policies. This came out in Jim Crow laws, where you had segregation based upon who could drink from what water fountain, who could use what restroom. Those were enforced by police. Those were enforced by the criminal justice system. So it wasn't just laws of, I don't like you because you're this, I don't want you to live in my neighborhood. You could go to jail if you broke these laws and you weren't the right color. So how did race get supported by criminal law? Well, let's look at a statute. So you might not be able to read this, but who was punished under the civil law or under the criminal law very much depended upon how you were defined racially. So for a person of color to commit any willful homicide, for a person of color to commit an assault upon a white woman, for a person of color, so on and so forth. So when we hear these terms, person of color, today, it's not just that these were something that were just created. They were in the law, which means judges had to decide what they meant based upon who was in their courts. Police had to enforce these laws. And this particular law was developed in 1865, and this is a part of what we call the Black Codes. Okay, so this is an example of how race was enshrined in law. Moving forward, so how do I know if I'm a person of color? Well, the law takes care of that. It's defined. So all free Negroes, mulattoes, so people with mixed heritage, often black and white, mestizos, people with either native or Mexican heritage of that region, freed women, so women, it doesn't specify what skin color, so on and so forth, and all descendants through either blood or sex are known as persons of color. And what I find particularly interesting is this statement here. Except that every such descendant who may have Caucasian blood, 7/8. Now, we're not talking about DNA lab times. How you were 7/8 Caucasian, to me, has been fascinating. I don't know how judges decided that. I do, but of course, how they decided it without DNA testing and some of the technology we have now, it was made up. A lot of times they looked at you and they said, oh my goodness, it looks like you have maybe about 3/8. We'll say that. That's not science, but this was how the law was enacted. This is how race was supported. It was supported through the judge's interpretation of these laws that already created division. So this... in some ways. And even with octoroons, that type of terminology, it depended on the judge. And because that was a very political statement. To say someone was white was a political statement. So you could be, one person could be essentially seen as white in one courtroom and non-white or a person of color in another one. So this is what makes this type of interpretation of the law very fascinating in practice. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how these Yeah, and this also relates to this term, the one-drop rule, which is another phrase of that. If you have one drop of African blood in you, or if you could see that there was one drop, you were African. Or if you had one drop of native blood, you were native. Also depending on who was saying this. There was a lot of power in determining who was under one racial category or not. And so this is one of the things that became even more important as it depended on who the police was allowed to arrest. So this is why race and identity becomes the center of U.S. politics, not just criminal law, but how we see ourselves in general, in our political decisions, in our rights, in our freedoms, and so on and so forth, because a lot of times we were defined by this. And we're not talking about just the history as far as the black codes. Jim Crow is a very recent policy. The segregation of the South is very recent. My mother grew up in Jim Crow, and she's not old, and I would never call her old. But she definitely experienced the effects of this law when she was growing up. So this is still very, very recent. One way to see how this has lasting effects on criminal law, here is a 2012 map of the city of Chicago. Raise your hand if you've heard of Chicago. Okay, yeah, good. All right, pretty popular. I try to stick to the popular cities. So Chicago is one of these cities that was heavily segregated during what we call the Great Migration, where a lot of African Americans or black people fled the South during Jim Crow and went north. Many of them went to Chicago, but laws and policies kept them living in the same neighborhoods. So if you look at these dark areas represent the percentage of individuals who are considered black, all right? And the lighter the color means the more white the neighborhood and the more white the demographic. So you can see that you have essentially color blocks of neighborhoods that are primarily African American. And this is important because the resources that go to these neighborhoods that are African American were often and historically less than those that went to those areas that were considered white. So schools, the funding that go into schools, the type of jobs that go into the communities really did depend on what kind of community it was. So the darker areas tend to be poorer areas. in Chicago, where you have a lot of violence, where you have a lot of guns. And this has not changed over time because, as we know, when you move into a place, a home, you don't tend to move very often unless there's some sort of event, okay? So people tend to stay in their homes and their families and their areas tend to stay in places for a very long time. So these neighborhoods that started out being predominantly black, as white people moved out into the suburbs, they continue to lose resources. And so now when you visit them, they look very different from their white community counterparts, especially as it relates to crime. And so these particular issues as it relates to criminal justice means that these areas have high crime. There's high levels of poverty, so people do not have jobs. There's high levels of guns, so you have a lot of murder that tends to happen, a lot of violent crime that happens in this area, which means you have a larger police presence in these areas, which can create a lot of conflict with those neighborhoods based upon policies over time. And we saw this over the summer. Over the summer, there were a lot of protests in cities because of police violence. And it wasn't just the George Floyd case that was important. There was the case in Chicago of a young teenager who's 17 years old, Laquan McDonald, who was shot in the back by police officers. He was unarmed. And so these issues have been happening for a very long time in these cities, which has affected the way that they came together this year, especially given COVID and especially given the fact that people were even more restricted from working and earning due to COVID restrictions. And this resulted in violence between the police and protesters, and even what we might see as cultural violence. So violence that is used to harm but is connected more to cultural things, aspects, stuff of meaning in a society. For example, this police officer was fired because he posted on his Instagram, "Let's start a riot." And it was not a statement, it was actually a song. I like the song, by the way, but it was not this song that got him fired. It was these attitudes that were connected to the song that legitimized some of these harmful attitudes towards the communities who were protesting. And actually, this police department fired him because of numerous posts and numerous activities or behaviors that were seen as problems as far as solving some of the issues between police and the communities. And then you have those who are counter-protesting or seeing as supporting the police officers as it relates to protests. So militias and right-wing militias are also increasing and seeing themselves as having a role in enforcing criminal law. They are there to make sure that the burning doesn't happen and the businesses aren't destroyed. These are their words. We're here to make sure that we are protecting the community because the police have their hands tied. All right. So this is how some of these issues have developed, especially in 2020, based upon some very unresolved issues in communities, and especially communities of color. So as such, as we're talking about politicians, this is where race comes into party politics. And this has been one year where race and party politics has been quite interesting for me personally. I can't speak for anyone else, but I've really gotten into looking at race and how this has come out in party politics, especially in the recent election of Donald Trump. So one of the things that is often discussed is how there's a division between the representation, those politicians that are elected for Democrats versus those politicians that are elected for Republicans. And you can kind of see in these this last photo of the Congress people that were elected in 2018, what that difference is between red and blue. Now, of course, diversity is not just race or skin color. It can mean many different things such as viewpoints, lifestyle, so on and so forth. But visually, the representatives on the Democrat side tend to be more diverse in the communities that they come from, which is something that is often discussed as one of the benefits of this democratic process. You could come from a population that's historically disadvantaged and then end up being the ones making the laws and enforcing the policies yourself. So this is one of the struggles that the Republican Party has had based upon image as well as in elections. But this is changing, because you do have an emergence of African American Republicans and Republicans from all different backgrounds. So this is something that they have also noticed. So it's not so easy to just say that one party is more racist than another, one party does not adhere to the needs of the community than the other, because this is also different from state to state, city to city, and county to county. Republican parties are not a monolith. For example, I use Indiana because I'm from there. This is where I'm going to. The GOP has started a diversity in leadership series. The governor, who was recently reelected, Governor Eric Holcomb, recently nominated 3 black female judges to the courts. So the parties are no longer just seen as supporting one group of people versus the other. And this is also something that has impacted the way politicians have seen, or voters have seen, presidents. And this is something that is also overlooked as it relates to some of our past elections and even our current election. For example, this woman, you may have seen her before. She seems pretty familiar. Hillary Clinton. She ran in 2016. One of the major controversies behind her and her time as the First Lady was her comments on super predators. Now, super predators is this idea, this term, that reflected young males, teenage males often, or adolescent males, and many of them, as you saw, as you might have it turned on the news during that time and saw, they were males of color. They were convicted of crimes that were often violent and serious, and criminologists thought that this was going to be a trend, that this was going to increase. There were going to be more of these ruthless males in society, many of them males of color, that were going to threaten a lot of people's livelihood. They were called super predators. And this was based on numbers and what some people say science. Well, this never happened. But Hillary Clinton repeated this term, super predators, and this led to many policies and laws that impacted African American communities, and especially increased punishment on young adolescents, males of color. So this topic of mass incarceration, where you had people going to jail, many more people going to jail longer, 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds getting life in prison without parole. Okay, so never having the chance to come out, and you're only 15 and 16 years old. These type of things came from this idea that super predators were going to be a threat to American safety. Joe Biden fell in that category as well. Joe Biden was the author of the 1994 crime bill, and the crime bill had some of those same effects as the language. It included more heavier penalties for crimes, longer jail sentences, more police in those communities. And so the effects of those policies did not impact all of America. It impacted those communities, just like we saw with Chicago, that were already almost siloed because they had a lot of poverty, they had a lot of crime. And so this also did not help the relationship between police officers and the communities that they were present in. And this also affected the way Biden received votes this year. So you had a lot of African American men and a lot of African Americans that did increasingly vote for Trump this year because Biden was seen as one of those candidates that were responsible for a lot of those criminal policies that affected that group negatively. And on the other spectrum, Trump got Kim Kardashian. And I'm not sure if you know who this Kim Kardashian is. She's a pretty big deal. She's on social media. She has a very large international following culturally. And now she's the face of criminal justice reform. And under Trump, she initiated a program with the goal of releasing people from prison. And it was a great program for criminal justice reform, looking at cases and releasing those who had been unfairly imprisoned or reducing prison populations. And so this looked favorably on Trump. And this was something that was not only supported by Kim Kardashian, who is also studying to be a lawyer, but also Ivanka Trump, Trump's daughter. So this was an initiative that was used to promote his efforts to support the African American community as far as criminal justice reform. Also, going back, I hate to go backwards, but this senator, Senator Tim Scott, was the author of one of the police reform bills this summer. He is a Republican, and this police reform bill was mentioned by Trump in one of the debates as far as one of the many things Trump felt he did for the African American community. So this is how crime and also politics can affect the way people see politicians, especially when it comes to voting, which is what matters, right? And this is another thing that people did not see as often on the local levels. You had a lot of people, governments responding to the protests during the George Floyd protests this summer by looking at the way police were interacting with protesters. Now, this stuff happened more on the local level. This is Indianapolis, my hometown. But you did have a conscious effort for politicians, regardless of whether it's an election year or not, looking to say, okay, this is not good. We need to change something. So you had police reform, and you had a lot of topics about police reform as it relates to race. All right? So my last section, I want to talk a little bit about identity and how it relates to voters and how they decide. I talked a lot about African American voters as it relates to the historical connections between crime and race, but there are some other nuances to identity and how it relates to how they chose politicians this year. So as a review, we have the African American votes and voters and what we call these voting blocks. So when you see or you hear about political strategy as far as how people want to gather votes from different identities or different communities with a certain identity, they talk about voting blocks. So the African American voting bloc has traditionally voted Democrat since around the time of Jim Crow. There were switches and alliances. So during the time of emancipation, African Americans voted Republican. And this changed. There was a Southern strategy. There was a change in targeting evangelicals and Southern Democrats to switch to the Republican Party. And so this had changed over time. So now you have predominantly Democrats vote, or Democrats tend to get the support of African American voters. And in this election with Joe Biden, this has made some of the strongest showings in history, especially in states that are considered swing states like Georgia. Exactly, exactly. Yeah, Stacey Adams and a lot of voting rights advocates did that by understanding the laws and looking at the ways that voters were suppressed, and changing those things. And so this is where you have a large movement about black voting mattering. Black voters matter. You might even hear black women tend to vote overwhelmingly Democrat versus other voting blocs. Then you have Hispanic Americans or Latinx Americans. Now, this is a very complicated block because if we look at the way this group is identified in the media or even in government documents, it does not necessarily get to the heart of what a Latinx or Latino voter is, okay, or Latina voter is. You have many Spanish-speaking or Latin American descendant people in the United States, and they're all grouped in the same category. So then you have to distinguish a little bit about what we're talking about when we're talking about Latin American. And this is very interesting as it relates to politics. So as you've seen, Florida went red for Trump. Florida tends to go red for a lot of people, so this was not so surprising. But there was a large voter turnout for Trump in the Latino community. And so within the Latino community, you can start to find some differences between where voters are from. So for example, Cuban Americans are considered Latino voters or Latinx voters, but the politics and the history of Cuba is very, very different than other countries and other people who come from other Latin American countries, such as Puerto Rico or even the Dominican Republic. Many islands in the Caribbean as well have different histories as well as their relation to politics. So this tends to be very tricky when it comes to how do you get the Latino vote. Because you're not just talking about Mexican or Mexican American or Mexican descendants. And a lot of people tend to think that way when it comes to this voting bloc. And as it relates to criminal law, this voting bloc tends to be very important because of immigration. Immigration laws, which can be both civil as well as criminal laws. So if you are if you're in the country illegally, you can be arrested. There were a lot of news reports about families being separated at the border in detention centers. The detention centers themselves have been accused of some very terrible things like euthanization of, sterilization, not euthanization, but sterilization of women, and also other types of alarming acts. And this very much affects this voting population who is closely connected to migration from Central, South American, and Caribbean states. So this is also very interesting as it relates to how they vote and how they see their candidates. And it also pretty much could have played a big part in the way people voted for Biden versus voting for Trump. The next voting bloc we have are indigenous population, Native American. And this population is extremely interesting because they have had an increase in political representation. You had a record number of Native Americans that ran for Congress versus previous years. So now you're starting to see some of these voting blocs getting involved and becoming politicians, becoming the lawmakers themselves. And so this is where people have learned the system, learned this American system of democracy, really engaged other people in voting to try to change the system themselves. And this is something that made a big difference as it relates to even presidential turnout. For example, this is Arizona. So Arizona went to Biden, and these areas that are blue are Indian reservations. So Indian reservations roughly tend to go overwhelmingly for Democrats as well, okay? And also cities as well. So not all of them are Indian reservations, but a large portion of those Indian reservations did take their vote towards Joe Biden. The next voting bloc that we have are Asian Americans. Now, this is very much like the Latinx, Latino voting population, because what it means to be Asian American means a lot of different things. There are a lot of countries that are considered Asian, and some that are considered Asians, where the people who come from those countries or descendants of those people may not consider themselves to be Asian. One of the voting blocs that was increasingly important this election was Indian American voters, and they're considered Asian American. Now, traditionally, the Asian American vote has not been targeted. This was something that many voters had said, well, we don't get engaged in politics, no one asks about it. There are some connections to immigration status, and relationship between the state. But this year, Indian American voters became extremely important, not just because the Vice President elect Kamala Harris has Indian heritage, but also there was a very strong relationship between Donald Trump and Prime Minister Modi from India. So you also had a connection between very traditional or even conservative values coming from India, where people still have a strong connection to, even if they are American, and also a leader that was really supported. So you even had Trump-Modi rallies in the U.S., in Texas. So this voting bloc has stood out this year compared to some of the other voting blocs within the Asian American population. Then you have the Arab American population, which tends to be conflated with Islam American and so on and so forth. And so this is another very complex, dynamic population, but really did play a big part in Michigan. The representative, one of the congresswomen from Michigan, is Rashida Tlaib. She is Palestinian American, and there was a large drive of American Arab voters in Michigan that made a difference in the election turnout this year. So this voting population has changed, whether they might have classified themselves as people of color or white. It's often conflated with religion, which can connect to ideas and thoughts and perceptions regarding terrorism and protection, which has been very controversial over the last 4 years during Trump's presidency. Then we have those who embrace their identity as Trump supporters, as the voting bloc. These voters are not necessarily just what you would call Caucasian or white voters. There's a deeper sense of connection to Trump, where they embrace the terms deplorables. They're not just what people might perceive as uneducated. In the 2016 election, it was really made clear that white college-educated women supported Trump. And so this voting bloc is also something that can be related to racial identity, but has also itself become very complex over the last 4 years. So what I will say in kind of wrapping up is there are many different types of Americans that have been working hard to get the best election results. It was a close election, and more people voted in this election than ever before in history. And as we can see, not just from my presentation, but also from the protests this summer surrounding George Floyd, the change in our legislature is that the look of what America is and who is a part of the American population is very much changing and has changed a lot. And even though there are complications in these terms of race and identity, this is something that people really do embrace to try to make changes. So in a country where you have women who were enslaved not so long ago, now enforcing the law is something that really adds to this sense of American pride and democracy and so on and so forth. And you will see a lot of this moving forward. So there are a lot of different Americans that have dedicated themselves to trying to change things, both in the elections, not just for the president, but also in trying to reform criminal law. And if you want to encourage your American friends to vote, please have them vote in the primaries, because this is not over. We still have elections to go. 2020 was definitely a mess of a year, but 2021 is coming and elections still continue. So if you do have American friends, tell them, regardless of how they feel, they should still vote. It still is a thing. We still need to fix a lot of things, but if they vote, we can test it out and see what works and what doesn't, okay? So we definitely want to encourage as many Americans to continue voting and being a part of the process. And then if you haven't, I encourage you to get out of the bubble and get out of looking at just the viewpoints that are close to you and engage in a lot of different viewpoints as it relates to these issues of politics, especially the perception of American politics. Now, this is a time I thank you for your time and attention. And as I said earlier, if you have any comments or questions or just in general notes, I would love to hear from them. Love to hear them and hear from you. Is it possible that I can have questions for you? Or do you have a question? Yes. Yes, please. I'm ready. I think this is an interesting point because there are a lot of factors to that. It's not just politics. I also think there has been a massive change in the way we communicate in our society. Not just American society, but society in general. I will say that the division is not just in the politics, but in the reward for certain decisions. U.S. politics, in a way, has become the most watched source of entertainment since 2010. Or since 2008, I would even say, or before then. I mean, you just think about the way that our politics has been treated internationally. It's become theater. I'm sorry? Ron, as far back as Ron Mango. Mm-hmm. Reagan was an actor. Exactly. He was an actor. He was a Hollywood actor. He was a good actor in some, depending on what side, you fall on. Depending on how you see film quality. But he was an actor. And so he had training. He had the training to engage people, which is what he did. Reagan engaged a lot of people. And that creates some sense of belonging, some sense of community, which is something that Trump has also gained. But Barack Obama also took that to the next level. One of the things that was really fascinating about Barack Obama's campaign was the introduction of music, celebrity, branding, marketing into politics. He became a trademark himself. Those hope posters, he became a trademark himself. And Trump just followed right along with that. And he was able to do even more because he diverged this into the news media. So Fox News, CNN, BBC, all of these news platforms, the year that Trump was elected, they made record profits. The other thing I think is very interesting about this kind of divide and how it plays into, or how it can be supported by media, for example. I'm not sure, I don't know all countries and politics, but the U.S. is one of these countries where you can get a book deal. You can become a published author. I'm still trying to become a published book author. But if I ran for Congress or if I ran for Senate, I get 2 or 3 book deals right away. So thank you. I actually had the recommendation to think about Senate, so this might get me published much quicker than I'd like. But yeah, so yes, I mean, we have a large entertainment value invested in our politics, and people react to that. When people start to know their watch, they perform. Not saying that this is what politicians are doing, but it definitely does not help. So I think when we start to look at politics more seriously instead of entertainment, or when politicians start to get away from this celebrity culture, I think we might have more of this coming together, because the boring stuff happens, communication and togetherness and cooperation tends to be very boring. I don't know many television series that really do promote that. I mean, it really becomes theater. And so hopefully this will be a trend as we start to have people who were traditionally in the spotlight. Let's see what the Senate will do over the next term. Lindsey Graham, Mitch McConnell, they're getting older. We'll see if they, as time goes on, if who replaces them. Maybe these are the opportunities to change some of that political culture, and that's a big problem with the political culture. It's high celebrity value. Yes. I don't know if there's a main problem into this. I think a lot of these things kind of develop together, and it's hard to really separate what's more of a problem. It's not that I think that politicians do present themselves as celebrity that want to be. It just becomes it becomes that way. For example, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. She has very left views. She's supposed to be identified as a very progressive voice, but she's doing covers of Vogue magazine in thousands and thousands of dollars outfit. Is this the role of politics? Is this the role of politicians? Is this how you get your message out? I mean, putting your views or promoting something in a newspaper is much different, but we also have this kind of changing view of media and the role media is supposed to play in our political discourse, which when we're talking about, the way the internet works and the way some of these media companies have formed, this becomes kind of difficult because our world is changing. So it's hard to say that if we can separate it, that will do the trick because we've already kind of grown up around it. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, I think one of the things also to remember, as I just lectured about, is a lot of our identity in the U.S. is tied to politics because politicians and laws defined who we were in the society, whether we were black, whether we were white, so on and so forth. So we kind of grow up with this identity thing, and it takes in other forms. I'm for climate change. I'm for Trump. I'm a deplorable, so on and so forth. Identity becomes very, very important in some sense. Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? Mm-hmm.
I've got to put in both camps, so to speak, insofar as a professor, I would consider myself, well, not exactly. I would be called a liberal. I've been asked, are you a liberal, sir, in the US? And here's my answer. But, and on the other hand, I'm a volunteer firefighter, and I can reach people via that route, and I talk to them, and they're from some of them are really great people, but I find they complain about this erosion process. They see it happening around them, everybody for themselves, and that seems to be what Trump's calling rather than anything like a spirit of what he is. It's more like I'm up here and I can make America great again in the sense that you all get a share of the cake before it vanishes. Mm-hmm. There's sort of the distribution of the rest of it, and if you want any of that privilege that I'm enjoying, come to me. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Biden is not calling for a union, he doesn't use the term solidarity because that's socialism, but why is it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think one of the challenges, both on the side of Trump voters and I wouldn't say versus Trump voters and those who who voted for Biden this year, is that there is a sense of community and belonging on the Trump side, but a lot of those people feel like they don't belong, that they've been outcasted, that they've been separated because they don't quite fit in the changing views, or they don't quite understand the changing view, or they disagree with the changing views. One of the things that really hurt that political divide was when Hillary Clinton called Trump supporters a basket of deplorables. She essentially said, you don't belong. You're voting for someone, and you are racist, sexist, xenophobic, so on and so forth. And even if you're not, you still don't belong. You're in your own basket. She put these people in a basket, and they have not forgotten that. And one of the things that Trump has done, he has retweeted them. He has these rallies, and these rallies are not just him saying, I'm great. These rallies are saying, what are you thinking? What are you thinking? I agree with you. I agree with you. He gives them the attention that he likes. And sometimes people really just want attention to their views and who they are. So I think this is where a lot of the divide will continue unless you do have, especially Biden, in an attempt for unity, going to the people who voted for Trump and saying, okay, what did I do wrong? What can I do? How can I bring you in? Because even though you had 75 million plus 80 million voting for Biden, there's still 70 million people, 72 million people that need attention. And how do you give them attention? And so if politicians want to be able to sow this divide, if the people who are giving a spotlight to American politics really want this divide to decrease, then they will start to look at how are we giving attention to voters coming in. Maybe not if they're comfortable in the basket, fine. How can we just pull the basket over, right? We'll have a couple of baskets, we'll have a cup, we'll have a bowl, we'll do this together, even though we don't agree on a lot of things. So I think that has to be the first step. But as long as they're seen as and I think that this really did hurt them. I think that word deplorable was really damaging to them. It was an insult. It was an insult. And to be called something like deplorable, just like being called, people tend to, especially in a rebellious spirit, embrace the identity of the negative thing that they're called. Oh, I'll be that. I'll be a B word. I'll be an N word. I'll be a deplorable. Because it is in response and in reaction to that insult in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay. That's an amazing question. I can't just respond right away, so I'll need some processing time. No, that's a really good question because as it relates to the Republican Party, post-slavery, Reconstruction, I mean, you did have progressive values, but you also did have some strong support for small government. Because the government was the problem. The government enslaved, the government did a lot of things that were incorrect. So limiting government power is something that tends to be consistently Republican, not necessarily just changing with the change of the voting blocks. You also have on the Democrat side, a strong support for, how do you say this? But the working class, which tends to be very strong in the South. for Southern Democrats and Southern Democrat voters, whether they be black or white historically. So those type of sentiments of values have lasted in the party over time. What has changed a lot is the role of certain values, such as religious values and Christianity and so on and so forth. So you have the Democratic Party in a lot of African American communities being Christian. And these conservative Christian values can often be the same, whether you're black, white, or other, especially if you're looking at more evangelical faith. So that's also something that has been quite interesting over time. But it really does depend regionally on the, or not just regionally, but even statewide, locally, on what are some of the more important things for American or for Republicans versus Democrat voters. But good question. Maybe not perfect, but I definitely try to process it. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you for inviting me and having me. Yes, keep watching. And please, also watch in the primaries. That's where a lot of these things happen. But don't lose focus. We need your attention. Thank you.